Okay, so why don't we get started? As it is, according to my watch, it's 7 o'clock. So this is lecture 5 of Who Wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls by Rabbi Lawrence Troster, Kesher, Israel in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And we're here on December the 1st. And we're going to look tonight at two things. Really, we're going to look at the most important text of biblical interpretation that is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And secondly, we're going to look at some of the liturgy that was found, because there are a lot of liturgical texts, mostly in small fragments, that were found at Qumran. And there's a lot of interesting questions about the liturgy. So most of the stuff we're going to do is in the material that I've given you rather than up there. But before we begin, it was either last time or the week before, somebody asked me about, in the translation, the word saints. And I said that the Hebrew was probably Hasidim. But I wanted to go back and look at the original. Now, I can't get a transcript, like a printed out of the Hebrew, but I can look at the original manuscript online. So it was from the community rule. This is looking at column 5, and this is line 13, okay? Because I went to the reference that somebody asked me about, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and you may not be able to read it, but this says, Anshe HaKadosh. That's what it meant when the translator said saints, the holy men, okay? That was, Vermes uses the translation, or whoever it was uses the translation saints, but in fact it is literally the holy men, Anshe Kodesh. And that's what this says. I mean, if you read Hebrew, you can actually see this is Aleph, this is Nun, Shin, Yud, that's the Hey. It's a little different from the way we do today. That's the Kuf, that's the Vav, the Dalet, and the Shin. So this is in the kind of handwriting you find at Qumran, and you can get used to it if you read Hebrew. It's not too difficult to read, except if the manuscript's in bad condition. But I mean, I really, enlarged it, which is why it's so granular, to be able to show it to you. Okay, so there are 5 kinds of texts of biblical interpretation that are found at Qumran. The first is called the reworked Pentateuch. Namely, you take the text of like a book of the Torah, and it's kind of written out in a more popular way, a little rearranged and so on. So it's kind of take the original text and rework it, sometimes into, it's not really a translation, it's not really a commentary, but it's kind of a rephrasing of it. The second, which is represented by a text called the Genesis Apocryphon, which was one of the first scrolls to be found, sets out to render the Bible story more intelligible and attractive by giving it more substance and reconciling it conflicting statements, and by reinterpreting it in the light of contemporary standards of belief that any passages which might seem to give offense. So in other words, the Genesis Apocryphon is a retelling of Genesis with all kinds of stuff in there that's not in the original. All right? And so it's just trying to sort of, because there are things in the Bible that are like, why is that there? Who is this guy? Like there's a few lines in the descendants of Cain. There's a guy named Lamech, and there's this little enigmatic poem there. So there's a whole story about Lamech in the Genesis Apocryphon. Yeah.
By contemporary standards, you're talking about 100 BCE.
Yeah, exactly. Their contemporary standards. The third time of commentary departs from the biblical text, relying on one or more several passages creates a whole new story. So in other words, taking a couple of verses and just going with it. The third are free compositions modeled on the Bible, like the Book of Jubilees, sorry for the spelling errors, the Book of Enoch, and the Giants, circulating together with the Bible. The one we're going to look at is the most important and most common, is called Pesher, which is, it's exegesis. It is line by line interpretation of the texts, mostly prophetic texts, not Torah. And They take the past prophetic texts and relate it to present-day events. Now, biblical interpretation goes back to the Bible itself. In other words, there are later texts in the Bible which are reinterpreting early texts, sometimes referring to or alluding to early texts. This is called intertextuality. It's what we also call midrash. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the word midrash. Midrash is often misused as a word to refer to legends. They're not. The word comes from the root meaning to seek out, usually to seek out an oracle, which means it's to plumb the depths of the Bible. And so midrash is a technical term usually applied to rabbinic interpretation of the text. And there's two kinds of midrash. There's halachic midrash that is on the laws in the Torah, and there is Aggadic midrash, Agadah, which is essentially everything else. Now, there are pre-rabbinic midrashim, and we see them in Second Temple literature. And one of the ways, so the Qumran people didn't really follow the same kind of midrash that the rabbis did. They had their own. And before the finding of the Pesherim texts, it was unknown. Okay? It was essentially unknown by scholars. So here's a little bit more about the word pesher. It's a Hebrew word meaning interpretation in the sense of trying to find a solution to something. It's only found in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, chapter 8, verse 1. It's what's called a hapax legomenon. There are no other uses of it in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and Kohelet is a late text, relatively speaking, and therefore it probably derived from the Aramaic, which when it's used in Aramaic, it usually refers to interpretation of dreams and the mysteries to be found in dreams. Now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's an interpretive commentary on Scripture. And what they do is, the writers believe that the Scripture is written on two levels. There is the level for ordinary readers with limited knowledge, and there is the concealed one for specialists with higher knowledge. Now, later in Jewish history, we in fact had 4 ways of interpreting Scripture, but the Pesher has there's the surface meaning and there's the deep meaning that is the mystery to be solved. Okay? So, for example, the Habakkuk Pesher, the author of the text asserts that God made known to the teacher of righteousness, one of the founders of the group, a prominent figure in the history of the Essene community, all the mysteries of his servants, the prophets. And according to this is divine revelation that the teacher of righteousness had to interpret the text. And that the prophets themselves didn't even know what the true meaning of the text were. And as you will see, Habakkuk is a late Second Temple prophet. The Pesher on Habakkuk is written hundreds of years later, and therefore is applied not to understanding Habakkuk in its original setting, but rather the historical setting of the Qumran community. And in fact, the Pesher on Habakkuk is one of our main sources for the history of the community. Anybody have any questions about this? So here are the list of the Pesharim that we have. So there are what are called the continuous Pesharim, and you can see, except for the last one, which is on some of the Psalms, they're all on prophets. And some of these are really fragmentary, but the Pesher Habakkuk is a little in better shape. And then they have what's called the thematic Pesharim, which tend to be, rather than on a single text, but on a variety of texts. How many people know what the florilegium means? I had no idea. It means an anthology. So one of the Peshers is an anthology of various biblical texts, and scholars have called it that. I have no idea why. Okay, so here is picture of the Pesher to Habakkuk, part of it. It dates from the writing and the parchment. It dates from around 30 BCE, and there are 13 columns that have survived, which is quite a bit. Problem is the bottom has really rotted away. All right, so I've given you the entire text of it here, and the way it works is that it quotes a text from Habakkuk, and then it gives you the Pesher. And wherever it says interpreted is the word Pesher, or a word derived of it. And anything that's in italics is from the book of Habakkuk. And this is on, what we have here are the Pesharim and Habakkuk cover most of the first and second chapters of the book. Okay? So, would somebody like to begin reading?
Oracle of Habakkuk the prophet. How long, O Lord, shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Interpreted, this concerns the beginning of the final generation.
So, the whole book of Habakkuk is not about his day, but the final generation of the world, which is in the day of the Qumran group. Go on.
Or shout to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you cause me to see iniquity and look upon trouble? Desolation and violence are before me.
Now, when you see the square brackets, that means that that's not actually in the manuscript, but we know what the verse is from the text of Habakkuk. By the way, the text of Habakkuk as in the Pesher is actually very, very close to the Masoretic text, which is very interesting. It doesn't really depart much from our text that we have today. Okay, and then there's a fragment of a Pesher. God, something probably bothered with God with oppression and unfaithfulness, and they rob riches. Read on.
There is quarreling and contention. So the law is weak, and justice never goes forth. Interpreted, this concerns those who have despised the law of God. For the wicked encompasses the righteous. The wicked is the wicked priest, and the righteous is the teacher of righteousness.
Okay, so here it is. The person who is the wicked in Habakkuk is the wicked priest, and the righteous is the teacher of righteousness. Now, when was the Pesher written? Depending upon when it was written, is you can identify who these people are. So, if it is written according to Vermes, the sect started around the 150s. Then the wicked priest is one of three potential characters. One, it's Jonathan, the brother of Judah the Maccabee, who became, after Judah was killed in battle, became the high priest, even though he wasn't supposed to. Then he was assassinated, and then his brother Simon took it over, so it could be Simon is the wicked priest, or it could be Simon's son, John Hyrcanus. If we go for the later, around 50 years, 60 years later, it could refer either to the Hasmonean king Alexander Eunaeus, who's around the year 100, or one of the later, after him, John Hyrcanus II. But it's a high priest in Jerusalem who the teacher of righteousness is in conflict with. So it's either the middle of the 2nd century BCE or the early part of the 1st century BCE. Okay, read on.
So justice goes forth perverted. Behold the nations and see, marvel, and be astonished. For I accomplish a deed in your days, but you will not believe it then.
Interpreted.
I don't know what the total
Then told. The two, the double I is the column marking.
Okay. Interpreted. This concerns those who were unfaithful together with the liar, in that they did not listen to the word received by the teacher of righteousness from the mouth of God. And it concerns the unfaithful of the new covenant, in that they have not believed in the covenant of God and have profaned God's holy name. And likewise, this saying is to be interpreted as concerning those who will be unfaithful at the end of days. They, the men of violence and the breakers of the covenant, will not believe when they hear all that is to happen to the final generation from the priest, in whose heart God set understanding, that he might interpret all the words of his servants the prophets, through which he foretold all that will happen to his people and his land.
Now the priest here is the teacher of righteousness. But notice, the teacher of righteousness gets his knowledge direct from God. It's like he is a prophet. Now, who is the liar? It could be the wicked priest, or it could be a different religious authority in Jerusalem at the time, which has been theorized to be the head of the Pharisees. So it could be one or the other. All right, would somebody like to read on page 2?
For behold, I rise the Chaldeans.
Rouse.
What did I say, raise?
Yeah, rise.
For behold, I rouse the Chaldeans, that bitter
And heavy, should be heavy.
And heavy nation. Interpreted, this concerns the Kittim, who are quick and valiant in war, causing many to perish. All the world shall fall under the domination of the Kittim, and the wicked, they shall not believe in the laws of God.
Now, who are the Kittim? It's evident that the word Kittim comes from a use of it in the book of Daniel, but the Qumran people are using it as a code word for the Romans. Now, either whether you date this early or late, the Romans have not yet taken over the land of Israel. That doesn't happen until about 60 BCE. So, but the Romans have gone into the Middle East. They have pushed themselves into it. They are conquering the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. And the Romans, of course, are known to be the best army in the world. So it says, quick and valiant in war, causing many to perish. The Romans didn't fool around when it came to conquering areas. Some cases they practiced genocide and exterminated whole groups of people. Okay? So, Bert, read the next one. They shall march.
They shall march across the plain, smiting and plundering the cities of the earth. For it is, he said, to take possession of dwellings which are not their own.
Now, in the original Habakkuk, he was referring to the Babylonians, right? I mean, that's what the Chaldeans are. Here, so then read the interpretation.
They are fearsome and terrible. Their justice and grandeur proceed from themselves. Interpreted, this concerns the Kittim, who inspire all the nations with fear and dread. All their evil plotting is done with intention, and they deal with all the nations in cunning and guile.
Read on.
Their horses are swifter than leopards and fleeter than evening wolves. Their horses step forward proudly and spread their wings. They fly afar like an eagle and devour all of them, and all of them come for violence. They'll look on their faces as like the east wind. Okay,
so again, this is, notice, come afar from the islands of the sea, meaning they come on ships to the Eastern Mediterranean, and this may be a mistaken idea that somehow the authors thought that the Romans came from some place which was an island. They may not have known their geography that well, but this is about the Roman invasion of the Eastern Mediterranean that occurred in the early first century BCE. Okay, somebody want to pick it up where it says, they heap up captives like sand.
They scoff at kings and princes, are their laughing stock. Interpreted, this means that they mock the great and despise the venerable. They ridicule kings and princes and scoff at the mighty host.
Now, one of the interesting things, of course, is that in Rome at the time, there was no emperor yet. This was still during the time of the Roman Republic. So this doesn't mention the idea that they have a king. They scoff at kings. They don't have kings, right? And this is before Julius Caesar takes over and basically becomes a dictator. So this reflects the period before that. Go on.
They laugh at every fortress, they pile up earth and take it. Interpreted. This concerns the commanders of the Kittim who despise the fortresses of the peoples and laugh at them in derision. To capture them, they encircle them with a mighty host, and out of fear and terror, they deliver themselves into their hands. They destroy them because of the sins of their inhabitants.
So how do the Qumran people view the Romans?
Pretty tough guys.
Yes, but what are they actually? They're the agents of God's punishment. Okay? They describe them as terrible and wicked, whatever, but they don't really describe them as, they haven't attacked the Jews yet. Okay? So they haven't attacked Judea yet. That comes later. So they're not like, they see the Kittim, the Romans, as somehow being agents of God's punishment on the wicked of the world. It's very interesting how we can, just by what they say about them, how we can kind of locate them in history. Okay, somebody want to read the next one, the wind.
How is it interpreted that way, if they're agents of God?
Well, in the Bible you can, the Babylonians in the prophet Jeremiah are seen as, the Nebuchadnezzar is seen as the agent of God. In other words, that God uses various peoples to punish other people for their sins. So in this case, they're drawing upon good biblical precedent. Habakkuk, the original, was probably referring to the Babylonians. Here, the Qumran people are reinterpreting it as the Romans, not the Babylonians, and that the destruction they cause is not meaningless, it's not random, it's part of a divine plan.
Was it universal thinking at that time that whenever something evil was brought to the land, that there was God's punishment?
Well, by that point, the Jews certainly believed, and this had been a long time, that God was the king of the entire universe, the entire world, and everything that happens there is part of God's divine plan. And God utilizes, everybody.
Not so far from what the Christian right believes.
Well, all you have to do is read the prophets in the Bible, and you'll see that God is a God of history who acts in history, who uses people and moves them around, and if one group sins, it gets rid of them, and it's right there. And so the Qumran people were just drawing on what was already an ancient tradition about God. Even the idea that God, brings the Israelites out of Egypt and causes puts the plagues on the Egyptians and drowns their army at the Red Sea. That's not a natural event. This is God intervening in human affairs. Yeah.
Where are they seeing or learning of the fighting firsthand? If they're not in Jerusalem yet, and they're not,
Because they hear about them.
so it's word of mouth.
Oh, the Romans' reputation by this point was already quite strong. Absolutely. Word spreads. There was a whole, the Mediterranean was a lake in some ways in terms of people going all over the place. So they would have found out pretty quickly about them.
So with the Romans, that's why they said that they came in like eagles flying,
Yeah.
because they just took over.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, of course, I hadn't thought about it, but of course, the Roman legions used the eagle as their symbol. Right? That was one of the holy symbols of the legion, and if the legion lost its eagle, the legion was considered disgraced because it was their standard.
What about the word Kittim? Did everybody know what that meant? Like, is that like the
Not
code?
necessarily, no. The Qumran people used it. The rabbis used the term to refer to the Romans as Edom, the Edomites. They had in other words, they used these code words to do two things. Number one, to connect it back to these texts. But secondly, they didn't really necessarily want people, in rabbis' day, they didn't want the Romans knowing all the things they were saying about them. So they didn't say the Romans,
To
they
avoid getting killed.
said the Edomites. Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's code language
Okay.
that minority groups and groups that are being oppressed will often use about their oppressors, right? Okay, so Brandon, why don't you read the next one, the wind.
The wind then sweeps on and passes, and they make of their strength their God. Interpreted, this concerns the commanders of the Kittim who, on the council of the house of guilt, pass one in front of the other, one after another. Their commanders come to lay waste the earth, and they make of their strength their God. Interpreted, this concerns all peoples.
Okay, I don't know what the house of guilt is, but the point is the Romans are powerful, unstoppable, and that's because they are the workings of God. Okay, so then read the next verse.
Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. You have ordained them, O Lord, for judgment. You have established them, O Rock, for
It should be chastisement.
chastisement. Their eyes are too pure to behold evil, and you cannot look on distress.
Okay, and the interpretations on the top of page 3.
Interpreted, this saying means that God will not destroy his people by the hand of the nations. God will execute the judgment of the nations by the hand of his elect. And through their chastisement, all the wicked of his people shall expiate their guilt who keep his commandments in their distress. For it is, as he said, too pure of eyes to behold evil. Interpreted, this means that they have not lusted after their eyes during the age of wickedness.
So here they're talking about who are the elect?
Them.
Them, exactly. There's going to be, the Jewish people will not be totally destroyed. The elect will still exist. And though their chastisement, all the wicked of his people, that means the rest of the Jews, shall expiate their guilt and who keep his commandments in their distress. All right, do one more, Brenda. Oh, traitors.
O traitors, why do you stare and stay silent when the wicked swallows up one more righteous than he? Interpreted, this concerns the house of Absalom and the members of its council who were silent at the time of chastisement of the teacher of righteousness, and gave him no help against the liar who flouted the law in the midst of their whole congregation.
Okay, so this goes back now to the history of the community itself. The house of Absalom may be the council in Jerusalem, and the liar, of course, is the head of the Pharisees, and at some points the Pharisees had the most political influence, and the rest of the council, or the people who were helping the king run the government, were probably Sadducees. So what's going on here? Apparently, there's at some point where the chief Pharisee was going after the teacher of righteousness, and everybody else stood aside and let it happen. And so that's how they interpret this text. Oh, traitors, why do you stare and stay silent? Right? Somebody want to read the next one? You deal with men like the fish of the sea.
You deal with men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things, to rule over them. They draw them all up with their fish hook, and drag them out with their net, and gather them in their
Sign, yeah. That is a word.
Yeah. Therefore they sacrifice to their net, therefore they rejoice and exult.
And burn, it should be burned.
And burn incense to their sign, for by them their portion is fat and the sustenance rich.
Okay, so this is 2 verses from chapter 1, and now read the interpretation, which the word interpreted is missing.
Yeah, the Kittim, and they shall gather in their riches together with all their booty, like the fish of the sea, and is for that which he said, therefore they sacrifice to their net, and burn incense to their seam. Interpreted, this means that they sacrifice to their standards and worship their weapons of war.
And this is actually true. Whoever wrote this had knowledge of the way the Roman armies acted. The legions would do sacrifices to their eagles, to their standards, okay? and worshiped their weapons of war. So this is actual knowledge of how the Roman army worked, which is really interesting. Go on.
For by them their portion is fat and their sustenance rich. Interpreted, this means that they divide their yoke and their tribute, their sustenance, over all the people, year by year ravaging many lands.
And that's exactly what they did. They went on campaigns, they plundered. That was a way in which the Roman Empire was upheld and taxation. So they've heard of all of this going on. It hasn't yet hit them, but they've heard of what's happening all over as far as I know, they knew the known world. Yeah.
Webster's has the word pronounced sane.
Sane? Okay. Okay. All right. Somebody want to read the next one? Therefore, their sword.
Therefore, their sword is ever drawn to massacre nations mercilessly. Interpreted, this concerns the Kittim who caused many to perish by the sword, youths, grown men, the aged, women, and children, and who even take no pity on the fruit of the womb.
Okay, and this is true. When the Romans captured a place, they often massacred all the men, sold all the women and children into slavery. If there was a revolt, they would kill basically everybody. They were known for their how brutal they were. That's one of the ways they got what they did, because people were afraid of them. Read on.
I will take my stand to watch and will station myself upon my fortress. I will watch to see that he will say to me, and how he will answer my complaint. And the Lord answered and said to me, write down the vision and make it plain upon the tablets, that he who reads may read it speedily.
And now we get the interpretation.
And God told Habakkuk to write down that which would happen to the final generation, but he did not make known to him when time would come to an end. And as for that which he said, that he who reads may read it speedily, interpreted, this concerns the teacher of righteousness, to whom God made known all the mysteries of the words of his servants the prophets.
So here it is. Habakkuk doesn't even know the full meaning of the visions he's seeing. It's only the teacher of righteousness who ultimately knows what is going on. And God may, in effect, the teacher of righteousness had revelation from God to the meaning of Habakkuk's visions. Anybody have any questions at this point before we plow on? Bert, you look like you've got something.
It's really fascinating, and I guess those who study this must have been just so exciting to get these texts. But now I forgot why I was. My question was that it'll come back.
Okay.
Later.
Well,
Okay.
Let me finish this thought.
Yes.
It's awfully hubristic of this guy, the leader of righteousness.
Yes.
I mean, if they were a sect that set themselves apart, why would they put up with this guy?
What do you mean? What? He was their inspiration. He was their leader. He was the one that brought them to their community and took them out of Jerusalem and helped them. And he was their Moses.
I was going to say, even Moses had people come up and say, you shouldn't do it all by yourself.
Well, the teacher of righteousness must have been a pretty inspiring guy. Okay? We have to just assume he was a charismatic leader. He was we're pretty sure he was a priest. He may have been of the line of Zadok, which would make him a more legitimate authority than the high priest in Jerusalem. The fact is, he must have been, again, we don't know what his name was. People have tried to associate him with various figures, but nobody really can do it. But he must have been an extremely charismatic, intelligent, creative, prophetic kind of figure.
So did the congregation feel protected when they read this, when under...
Well, this was part of the divine mysteries that the teacher revealed to them. So they wouldn't be interpreting contemporary events through the teachings of the teacher of righteousness's interpretations, right? So when they're reading the book of Habakkuk, it wouldn't just be reading it as it is. They would say, we really know what's going on here, and this will give us hope. This will give us security. The end of days is coming, and we're part of the elect, and we'll be saved, and all the other sinners will get schmeiced. That's what it's about. Bert, have you found your question? No.
It seems to me, though, that, assume there may be other texts, but what this tells us at least is what, from the interpretation, is what the knowledge was in that period. And is there anything else that tells us what life was like that the Romans, from other sources, were?
Oh, yeah. Tons of sources of what was going on. We know pretty well the entire history of that period, both from Roman writers and Greek writers. There's all kinds of archaeological stuffs and inscriptions. We actually have a very good knowledge of what was going on in the world at that time. We don't know everything, but we don't know who the teacher of righteousness was, but the Romans wrote histories of that period later on, but we have a very, very good knowledge about what life was like in those days. We have a lot of knowledge about the Roman army too, by the way, its organization, and we even know the histories of all the most of the legions, where they were stationed, who were their commanders. It's just an incredible amount of stuff like that available. Yeah.
But to what extent have computers been used to make these interpretations?
Well, they didn't have computers back then.
I know, but since we discovered these, there are interpretations that come out all the time on these scrolls, I think.
No. In other words, these interpretations are what they wrote back then.
Yeah.
And all we have to figure out is what are they talking about, and that often is an argument between scholars because computers are not going to help you. In other words, how did they solve who the key team were? Well, that was done through all kinds of analysis of texts, and everybody now agrees the key team were the Romans. The question is, when did the teacher of righteousness live? Did he live around 150 BCE or did he live around 100 BCE? That's something we can't solve at the moment.
Well, I'm wondering if scholars today are using computers.
Well, they are to scan things, but only to be able to read them better. In other words, the pictures that I show you of are digitalized now, but it doesn't necessarily help you understand if it's not explicit, right? Yeah, Thelma.
Did Josephus give a write about what happened to this community?
No, because no, he didn't actually, because he never mentions Qumran in particular. He does, we learned early, he writes a lot about the Essenes, and we know that the Essenes were involved in the war. And given what we know about the archaeological ruins at Qumran, we assume the Romans came in and killed everybody. It's pretty obvious that's how the community ended, because we can actually date when it was destroyed, and that works out to the right date for the war, around 68. I think 69, something like that, CE. Yeah.
I assume the research in these scrolls is still ongoing.
Oh, yeah.
What's the recent discoveries? Anything?
Well, it took a long time for the scrolls to be published because there was a lot of power politics in the scholarly community, and who had the scrolls. They weren't all found at once. And remember, there's thousands of it are in fragments, so even just to be able to read it. So was a huge effort. So what happens is that the earliest stuff that was found tend to have gotten studied the most. Like the Pesher de Habakkuk was one of the first scrolls found, so it's had a lot written about it. What you're seeing now is reevaluations, but when we get to the liturgy, most of the liturgical texts hadn't been published in the early 80s. And so, here it is, they were found back in the late 40s and early 50s, and they still hadn't gotten around because there's so many of these little pieces. So finally, the liturgical text got it, and then everybody sort of got to work on it to try and figure out what's going on there.
So it's still working?
Yeah, because there's serious disagreements amongst Dead Sea Scroll scholars as to who that community was.
Well, that was the basis of my question.
Right.
The current analysis of the interpretation
Well, that's the problem. I mean, I'm giving you what's considered the conventional interpretation of who these people are, but there are radically different interpretations of who they were. I'm saying they're Essenes. Some people think they were a group of dissident Sadducees, a group of priests. You know, but I still think the Essene theory works the best because of the parallels with how Josephus talks about the Essenes and the other proof that we have. To me, that seemed, personally, I think it's pretty conclusive. Okay, so we're down at the bottom of page 3. Would somebody like to read that? For there shall be yet another vision.
For there shall be yet another vision concerning the appointed time. It shall tell of the end and shall not lie. Interpreted. This means that the final age shall be prolonged and shall exceed all that the prophets have said, for the mysteries of God are astounding.
So the end of the world is going to come, but it's not going to happen suddenly. It's going to be a prolonged process. Okay, now we're at the top of page 4.
If it tarries, wait for it shall surely come and shall not be late. Interpreted. This concerns the men of truth who keep the law, whose hands shall not slacken in the service of truth when the final age is prolonged. For all the ages of God reach their appointed end as he determines for them in the mysteries of his wisdom.
Okay, so that's the men of truth are the Qumran community. All right, read the next one.
Behold, his soul is puffed up and is not upright. Interpreted, this means that the wicked shall double their guilt upon themselves, and it shall not be forgiven when they are judged.
Go on.
But the righteous shall live by his faith. Interpreted, this concerns all those who observe the law in the house of Judah, whom God will deliver from the house of judgment because of their suffering and because of their faith in the teacher of righteousness.
Now, the house of Judah could be the whole Jewish people, or it could be the Qumran people. Now, the next one is really, really interesting. Sorry for some of the typos, but go on, Suzanne.
Moreover, the arrogant man seizes wealth without halting. He widens his gullet like hell, and like death he has never enough. All the nations are gathered to him, and all the peoples are assembled to him. Will they not all of them taunt him and jeer at him, saying, Woe to him who amasses that which is not his. How long will he load himself up with pledges?
Okay, so this is just talking about, typical kind of, this is how an arrogant person, but as you'll see, this attaches this to a very particular person. Go ahead.
Interpreted, this concerns the wicked priest who was called by the name of truth when he first arose. But when he ruled over Israel, his heart became proud, and he forsook God and betrayed the precepts for the sake of riches. He robbed and amassed the riches of the men of violence who rebelled against God, and he took the wealth of the peoples, heaping sinful iniquity upon himself. And he lived in the ways of abominations amidst every unclean defilement.
So evidently the wicked priest started off okay, but then he became corrupt according to the Qumran people, and that's when he becomes the wicked priest. But apparently he started okay. All right. You want to keep going?
Okay.
One more?
Shall not your oppressors suddenly arise and your torturers awaken, and shall you not become their prey? Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you. Interpreted, this concerns the priest who rebelled and violated the precepts of God, to command his chastisement by means of the judgments of wickedness.
This is probably the wicked priest, the high priest, okay?
And they inflicted horrors of evil diseases and took vengeance upon his body of flesh.
Now, this may refer to Jonathan because Jonathan was assassinated. So it could be about the murder of Jonathan as the punishment for what he did. Go on.
And as for that which he said, because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you. Interpreted, this concerns the lost priests of Jerusalem, who shall amass money and wealth by plundering the peoples. But in the last days their riches and booty shall be delivered into the hands of the army of the Gittim, for it is they who shall be the remnant of the people.
So they're going to get, the Romans are the means of punishment. They're coming and they're going to punish the wicked who've done this. Yes, Nan?
So when we read that they inflicted horrors of evil diseases
Yeah.
and then took vengeance, does that give us a clue as to which of the high priests it was? Somebody who suffered all these illnesses?
Yeah, I don't remember how Jonathan got assassinated. I think it was pretty quick, but that's a good question. I'm not sure of the answer to that. All right, do you want to read the next one, Dan? Because the blood of men?
Sure. Because the blood of men and the violence done to the land, to the city, and to all its inhabitants, interpreted, this concerns the wicked priest, whom God delivered into the hands of his enemies, because of the iniquity committed against the teacher of righteousness and the men of his counsel, that he may be humbled by means of a destroying scourge, in bitterness of soul, because he had done wickedly to his elect.
So this is probably, this could refer to Jonathan being assassinated. Okay, take a look on the next page. We'll skip the next one, but take a look where it says, woe to him. Go ahead, Dan.
There's a bunch of them.
Yeah.
I'll do the first one. Woe to him
who builds a city.
Yeah. Woe to him who builds a city with blood and founds a town upon falsehood. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that the people shall labor for fire, and the nation shall strive for naught. Interpreted. This concerns the spouter of lies, who led many astray that he might build his city of vanity with blood and raise a congregation on deceit, causing many thereby to perform a service of vanity for the sake of its glory, and to be pregnant with works of deceit, that their labor may be for nothing, and that they may be punished with fire who vilified and outraged the elect of God.
Now this spouter of lies could be the wicked priest who's trying to rebuild Jerusalem and make it big. It could be the head of the Pharisees. But take a look, skip the next one, and read the one that says, woe to him who causes.
Woe to him who causes his neighbor to drink, who pours out his venom to make them drink that he may gaze on their feasts. Interpreted. This concerns the wicked priest who pursued the teacher of righteousness to the house of his exile, that he may confuse him with his venomous fury. And at the time appointed for rest, for the day of atonement, he appeared before them to confuse them and to cause them to stumble on the day of fasting, their Sabbath of repose.
So this is this is really interesting, that the wicked priest goes to where the teacher of righteousness and his group are on the day that's their Yom Kippur, which suggests they were operating under a different calendar, because the wicked priest, it wasn't his Yom Kippur, and he goes there to mock them and attack them. This is an actual incident that occurred. And because we know that the Qumran people, for the most part, were following a different calendar than other Jews were, because there was more than one calendar system around, and they were choosing one that was a solar calendar, probably. Whereas the rest of the Jews were probably using a lunar calendar with the corrections for the way we do it today. But the calendar is a really complicated issue, and it's where the sectarians argued one of the big issues, because there it is. What day is Yom Kippur? Right? That's a big deal. Okay, so again, if you keep going, you'll see about how they interpret all these biblical verses. And the one on the bottom of page 5, it refers to Lebanon. And Lebanon in the Bible, in the prophetic text, is a metaphor for the temple. Okay? Because the temple was partly built of the cedars of Lebanon. So Lebanon, and interestingly enough, though, they interpret it in a totally different way. They say, this saying concerns the wicked priest, this is the bottom of page 5, insomuch as he shall be paid the reward which he himself tendered to the poor. For Lebanon is the counsel of the community, and the beasts are the simple of Judah who keep the law. So they are interpreting Lebanon not as the temple, but as themselves. And the beasts in this phrase are the everyday Jews, okay, who do it. Okay, turn over the next page. He talks about how the wicked priest defiled the temple of God. And that's, again, the area of sectarian argument is who's running the temple correctly. And evidently the teacher of righteousness thought that the high priest was not doing all the things he should be doing. So it violated him. Okay? So that's the Pesher Habakkuk. It's fascinating because it's not trying to interpret Habakkuk in the way Habakkuk meant it, but trying to say this specifically refers to this event, this person, this person, this person, and that's a way for them to understand and give meaning to what is going on in their own day. In other words, when you look at any good preacher who bases themselves on a biblical text, they're not just going to tell you what it meant when it was written. They're going to try and relate it to your life, right? And to today. Now, we don't necessarily go this route today. We don't necessarily talk about, which of course some evangelicals do, by making specific identifications with ancient prophecies. But we take texts from the Torah and we look at them and say, what does it mean to us today? Right? So that's what biblical interpretation is really all about. It's, modern biblical interpretation is what did it mean when it was written? But traditional biblical interpretation is not really about that so much. It's more about what does it mean to me? What does it mean to us? How does it relate to what's going on in our lives? That's really what's so interesting about this stuff. And of course, a little later, the Romans did come in under Pompey the Great, Pompeius Magnus. He conquered Judea and the Jews became under direct Roman rule. And when you read the later texts, the Qumran people, they end up really disliking the Romans a lot and understanding that they saw the conflict with the Romans as being part of the end of days. And for them, it certainly happened that way. Okay.
Are there other examples, Rabbi, of the Qumran people interpreting other prophetic texts?
Oh yeah, as I said, there's a whole bunch of these, but unfortunately most of them are in very, they're fragmentary. Yes, this was a part of their literary activity, part of their religious activity was, and this was not, as I think it was not unusual. In other words, when you look in the description of their days in the community rule, the reading of scripture and interpreting it was a normal part of but that had been going on for hundreds of years in the Jewish community. The idea of a public Torah reading and somebody explaining it or translating it, that goes back hundreds of years before this. It's just a question of, whose interpretation is valid. That's one of the big issues. Who has the real knowledge of what the Torah and the rest of the Bible mean? And that was a conflict between Jewish groups. And you can see they are making the claim that the teacher of righteousness was inspired directly by God, who understood these texts even better than the prophets who originally said them. Any other questions about the biblical interpretation? Yes, Dan.
What I'm struggling a little bit with is the Qumran folks must have assumed that when the Bible was written or given, that it was not only was telling the story it was telling, but it was prophesying what would be going on 1,000 years later.
Yeah, well, in the case of Habakkuk, it's several hundred years. Yeah. Well, actually, they probably believed that in this particular case, that what Habakkuk was talking about had nothing to do with his own day. He didn't know that, though. I mean, that's a pretty strange claim, but that's what they say. That the teacher of righteousness understood this better than Habakkuk himself did. Okay, so one of the things that's been found, and these were some of the last texts to be edited and published, were lots of liturgical texts, prayers, and there are essentially 7 major categories of liturgical texts found in Qumran. There are ones that were obviously for some kind of fixed religious prayer service. And there's one called the daily prayers that we'll look at. That's 4Q503. There are ceremonial liturgies, including a marriage ceremony. There are eschatological prayers, meaning prayers about the end of days. One of the scrolls we haven't looked at yet, which is all about eschatology, is called the War Scroll, also called the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. It was, again, one of the first scrolls to be found in the first cave. There are prayers that are magical incantations, because magic was a normal part of life back then. There are collections of psalms, and what we're talking about here are psalms that are not part of the present-day book of Psalms. There are psalms found in Qumran that could be as old and just didn't make it into the book of Psalms. Because the book of Psalms is itself an anthology. But there were also psalms that the people themselves there wrote in the style of the biblical psalms. So there's a lot of that. One of the biggest collection of prayers is called the Thanksgiving hymns, or the Hodayot. And there's a lot of them. And we have, we have a fair bit. Part of the Hodayot appears to be written by the teacher of righteousness himself. And so they're called the hymns of the teacher. And there are other prayers which are embedded in narratives. In other words, there are texts that are narratives, like the various biblical interpretations, and characters in those narratives will say a prayer. So one of them is the Apocryphon of Joseph, which is this midrashic tale about Joseph, and in there he does a prayer. Okay? Anybody have any questions about this before we actually look at some of them? Again, a lot of them are in really just tiny little fragments, and it's very hard to interpret them. But the question that comes out of the prayer material is, did they write all this stuff themselves? Or is some of this material comes from what Jews were doing at the time in terms of prayer? We know that the rabbinic prayer service, which is what we still follow, wasn't really set until several hundred years later. We know that in the Bible, in the First Temple period, we don't know whether there was set prayer, since the major form of worship was sacrifice. And while people did spontaneous prayer, and the Psalms themselves, a lot of them obviously are liturgy of shrines and the temple in Jerusalem, especially when you get into the Second Temple, that more and more there seems to be liturgy in the temple in Jerusalem, but the sacrificial service is still the central form of worship. So were Jews beginning to develop regular prayers, not merely spontaneous ones, not merely reading out of the book of Psalms, but actually were beginning to do things that in a way forms a bridge between what we know about prayer in the Bible and what we know about the rabbinic service, which is what we follow. There are people who believe that some of this material that was found there was not written by the Qumran people, but represents liturgies that were common to Jews at the time. And they really have made a good case for that. That's really interesting. And one of the ways they've done is try to find out whether any of the language in any of these prayers is similar to early rabbinic prayers. And the answer is yes. There's vocabulary, there's common vocabulary there. So, let's take a look at a couple of these services. The first one is from 4Q503. That means the fourth cave, fragment 503. And it's been called the Daily Prayers. Would somebody like to read it? And just don't worry about all the spaces and brackets. It's just, as I said, it's not in great shape. They're fragments, but read it as best you can.
And when the sun rises, the firmament of heaven they shall bless. Answering they shall say, Blessed be the God of Israel. Today in the 4th of the gates of light, on the 5th of the month in the evening they shall bless. Answering they shall say, Blessed be the God of Israel, who hides before him in every division of his glory. Today, the 14th light of the day, peace be on you, Israel. When the sun rises to illumine the earth, they shall bless, and again the number shall be 11 days to the feast of joy. in the appointed times of glory. For this day is the 15th of the gates of light. Peace be on you, Israel. On the 6th of the month in the evening they shall bless, answering they shall say, Blessed be the God of Israel. And when the sun rises to illumine the earth, they shall bless, answering they shall say.
Then read the next couple of fragments.
Peace be on you, Israel. On the 7th of the month in the evening they shall bless, answering they shall say, Blessed be the God of Israel. On the 12th of the month in the evening they shall bless. This probably continues up to the 26th.
So does this sound at all familiar to you?
From the repetition, I'm not sure what it is, but it's sort of with the blessed be the God of Israel. It's sort of saying like Kylie Custo to me. I'm not sure that's what you're looking for, but
Well, one of the interesting things, of course, is that this is a kind of calendar of prayers, that there's differences depending upon what time of the month it is. But notice the prayers seem to begin at sunrise. This is talking about the illuminations. This is exactly what you find in our Shacharit service, in the early part of the Shacharit. So there's a lot of linguistic parallels between what's written here and what's in our rabbinic service. The first blessing before the Shema is the blessing for creation that's supposed to be done at sunrise.
And at sunset.
And yes, and the evening service is at sunset. Exactly. So this is one of the texts I think may have been, Jews, it's not just Qumran people. Okay? This to me is a really fascinating issue and one that I would love to explore more, but the main book that goes into this is published by Brill in the Netherlands, and anybody who knows, the Brill publications are enormously expensive. As a single book is like $150. But anyway.
It's not available on Kindle.
No. And even the used copies are really expensive. Okay, so let's take a look for what else we're going to do today. Let's talk. We won't probably get a chance to read all of it, but this is from the Hodayot. This is from the Thanksgiving Psalms, and this is one of them. It's number 12, actually. As you will see, it's 1QH12. XII. This is on page 7, and it means it was found in the first cave. H stands for Hodayot, and 12 is the column and the number of the psalm. And this is one of the hymns of the teacher. So there are scholars who actually believe the teacher of righteousness wrote this because there seems to be allusions to his life in here. But this doesn't come from the Bible. This is brand new, so to speak, and yet it sounds very biblical. Somebody like to read it?
I seek you, and sure as the dawn, you appear as perfect light to me. Teachers of lies have smoothed your people with words, and false prophets have led them astray. They perish without understanding, for their works are in folly. For I am despised by them, and they have no esteem for me, that you may manifest your might through me. They have banished me from my land like a bird from its nest. All my friends and brethren are driven far from me and hold me for a broken vessel.
Sounds like the teacher of righteousness' life, right? Okay. And using the phrase, smooth your peoples with words. That's go on, read a little more.
And they, teacher of lies and seers of falsehood, have schemed against me a devilish scheme, to exchange the law engraved on my heart by you, for the smooth things which they speak to your people. And they withhold from the thirsty the drink of knowledge, and assuage their thirst with vinegar. And they may gaze on their straying, on their folly concerning their feast days, on their fall into their snares. But you, O God, dost despise all Belial's designs. It is your purpose that shall be done, and the design of your heart that shall be established forever.
Okay, so you get the tenor of it, but it's Belial is a pagan deity in the Bible, but it's being used here to mean the devil, Satan. Okay, so if you take a look on the next page, he goes on about how they don't listen to your voice, meaning God's voice. and how there's going to be, a final judgment. And then in the middle of the page, he talks about how I'm clinging to you, I will stand, I will rise against those who despise me, my hand shall be turned against those who deride me. In other words, and he then, goes into a whole series of praise about God and how God is going to save the people who are the elect. If you go on the next page, on page 9, it says, through me, you have illumined the face of the congregation and shown your infinite power. For you have given me knowledge through your marvelous mysteries, and you have shown yourself mighty within me. This is how the teacher believed that he was receiving divine revelations.
Well, that's not so far-fetched. When countries go to war, they believe God is on their side.
Well, yes, that's true, but it's also there are people who believe that God speaks to them and God is inspiring them, and the question always is it really happening or is it not? In other words, when Jeremiah has his visions, is he just slightly psychotic or is he actually seeing something? And even in those days, it was a question of who's a true prophet? Who's really getting the word of God and who isn't? So even in the teacher of righteousness's day, when most of the time there weren't people claiming to be prophets so much anymore, but they were all claimed, it's all about who has the right interpretation of the Torah and of the rest of the Bible. And in the teacher of righteousness' case, he says, I have the right interpretations and you're all doing wrong because God is telling me the interpretation, not because I'm smart. It's because I'm divinely inspired. That's what he's saying here. You want to read a little further? Somebody want to read where it says, what is a creature of clay? This is really kind of cool.
What is the creature of clay for such great marvels to be done, whereas he is in iniquity from the womb and in guilty unfaithfulness until his old age? Righteousness, I know, is not of man, nor is perfection of way of the Son of Man. To the Most High God belong all righteous deeds. The way of man is not established except by the Spirit which God created for him, to make perfect a way for the children of men, that all his creatures may know the might of his power and the abundance of his mercies toward all the sons of his grace.
Now, his use of the term a creature of clay probably harkens back to the book of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is the one who compares us to clay in the hands of a potter, which is used by a medieval writer to write that beautiful piyut for the high holidays. But so he's probably referring back to Jeremiah here. But in effect, he's saying, how can this unworthy creature contain these wonderful mysteries? But God does it. And then in the next paragraph, he talks about how, his fear. His bones are broken. His heart is dissolved like wax. He remembers his sins. And in other words, he's confessing. And if you take a look at the end of it, he says, I lean on your grace and on the multitude of your mercies. You will pardon iniquity, and through your righteousness, you will purify man of his sin. Not for his sake will you do it, but for the sake of your glory, for you created the just and the wicked. So, again, this sounds very much like a lot of the stuff in the book of Psalms itself. And evidently, the teacher of righteousness, if he wrote this, was a pretty good liturgical poet. And he didn't write all the Hodayot, but they're like this. They're beautiful prayers, some of them, just magnificent. And they are indicative of the fact that there is this great liturgical tradition that preceded the rabbis, that until the time of the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we had no idea. We theorized that it existed, but we had no idea. We had very little that we could point to. We could look at some other ancient Second Temple works that are, were not in Hebrew, but later translations, and you find prayers in them, and you find references to liturgy. But this is the first, this is a real finding of authentic pre-rabbinic liturgy. Some of it is sectarian, and some of it was probably floating around and being used by all kinds of Jews. Anybody have any final questions for today? Good. So next week what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the eschatological texts. In other words, what was their vision of the end of the world? And in the last class, we're going to look at the connection between what do we see the connections from Qumran to early Christianity and early Rabbinic Judaism. In other words, what do we learn about these later groups from this particular group? Okay? Good. So have a good week.
Thank you.